It's been called the Golden City, the City of Peace, and God's home. With more than 3,000 years of continuous existence, it remains one of the most fiercely contested cities in the world. It's been conquered on almost 40 occasions, and has been completely overrun and destroyed 18 separate times. Jerusalem is, to Jewish and Christian alike, the holiest place on earth. Muslims consider it the third most holy site in their religion. But it takes no special faith to share in the pulsing energy of this vital and often controversial capital of the modern nation of Israel. As the geographic center of several diverse faiths, Jerusalem has seldom lived up to its name, the City of Peace. Since well before the time of King David, walls have been built to keep out the unwanted. And within each wall, gates have been constructed, through which the history of the world has marched, and will, as prophecy destines, continue to march. Indeed, one cannot enter this city, emotionally, spiritually, or physically, without entering through a portal of history. As you pass through these gates, you may think, as I do, that each one has a story to tell, an untold story spanning over 3,000 years. This, then, is the story of the gates of time. Join me now for a journey through these gates into the past of this incredible city, the city at the center of world history.
Just as the human soul is buried within the body, the old walled city of Jerusalem is surrounded by the traditional trappings of a modern urban area. Come in through the west, through the 19th and 20th century buildings of the new city area, or approach through the Muslim East Jerusalem section, and you eventually find the life and personality of this holy land. You find Old Jerusalem. This is a city within a city. Visitors soon realize that the true spirit of this international community lies in an ancient, protected enclave, walled off from the rest of the world. Today, the throngs that pack into Old Jerusalem pass through one of 7 major working gates. An 8th, walled-up gate is clearly evident, but is unusable. The blocked gate is the beautiful Golden Gate, a double entry that was bricked in during the 7th century by Muslims determined to thwart Jewish prophecy. Many Jews believe their Messiah or Savior will someday enter Old Jerusalem from the east through the Golden Gate. So Muslim occupiers blocked up the gate, and it remains closed to this day. The remaining usable gates are as varied and interesting as the old city itself. They each have close ties to the people, places, and events that for centuries have been shaping the face of world history. To enter or leave Old Jerusalem, you must choose a gate that suits your spirit. The Zion Gate in the southwest, scarred by bullet holes, teaches that in Jerusalem you must often guard your beliefs from those of your enemies. The Jaffa Gate in the west has welcomed the trade and ideas of empires. The New Gate in the northwest, without much history, was cut to allow a direct route into the Christian community. The busy Damascus Gate in the north is the most dramatic and elaborately decorated of the gates. Herod's Gate in the northeast is an entry for the humble. The Lion's Gate in the east leads into the Muslim quarter and out to the revered Mount of Olives. In the south, the Dung Gate takes us back to the days of Kings David and Solomon. In the scriptures, we are told that Abram, who was later called Abraham, left Haran for the land of Canaan, taking his nephew Lot with him. Abraham had already been blessed with material possessions from the Lord. However, Abraham stepped over in faith and compromised his wealth and security in response to God's call. He traveled to a land he knew not. He came to Shechem, which was rebuilt by Hadrian and named Neapolis or Nablus. In the time of Jesus, this was the home of the Samaritans and the place where Jesus talked to the woman at the well. It was here in Shechem that the Lord appeared to Abraham and gave him assurance that this land would be given to him and his descendants. Each day the streets and plazas of Jerusalem's old city fill up with people of faith. Most are religious pilgrims and tourists coming to visit some of the most revered and sacred historical sites on earth. Numerous different beliefs and religions are represented. Since the old city was the site of the ancient temple, it is the focus of the spiritual longing of all Orthodox Jewry. Mohammed is said to have had a heavenly vision on a celestial steed, which made Jerusalem forever sacred in the eyes of Muslims. And since many of the events in the life of Christ occurred in the narrow streets of Old Jerusalem, it is hallowed ground for Christians. Given the large-scale ambitions and wide scope of history encompassed by Jerusalem, the visitor may be surprised to find the actual size of the old city to be very small. Mark Twain, who came through these gates in 1869, claimed, "You could walk entirely around the city walls in an hour, if you walked briskly." In fact, a complete circuit of the wall covers only about 2.5 miles. Even today, after years of reconstruction, the old city is crowded and in constant need of repair. But no matter what condition it's in, Jerusalem's old city still bears witness to the grandeur of some of history's most powerful kings and rulers, and some of the most incredible feats of engineering and architecture ever undertaken. These walls that Twain saw as small and unimpressive are actually quite new by the standards of Old Jerusalem. They date back only to the early 1500s, when the Turkish ruler Suleiman I, often referred to as Suleiman the Magnificent, took control of Jerusalem and began a major program of urban renewal. When the Turks took control of Jerusalem, the city was in very poor condition. He directed major reconstruction of the wall, again completely circling and limiting access to the city. He repaired some of Jerusalem's holy places and improved the failing water system. But the work was done quickly and often carelessly. It is still obvious today that many of the large stones displaced when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in the 1st century were haphazardly set in place by Suleiman's workers. Suleiman's wall frequently strays from the path of earlier city walls, and old Roman wall engravings can be found upside down or out of place. With his efforts, Suleiman joined a long line of rulers who felt Jerusalem needed to be protected by a wall. Evidence indicates man first established a true community in the area nearly 3,000 years before Christ. Reasons for selecting this particular Judean hillside are fairly obvious. The area is well elevated, allowing for an easy defense. The water comes from the Gihon Spring, which has for centuries been praised for being surprisingly clear and clean. Nearly 4,500 years ago, a community of Jebusites built what is believed to be the first of the city walls. However, they left the Gihon Spring outside their new wall. To prevent an enemy from cutting off access to the water, they completed a secret tunnel to the spring. But for normal, peaceful times, they also cut what is believed to be one of the first of Jerusalem's gates, an entry placed near the spring, so the water could be easily carried into the city. Since that time, Old Jerusalem's walls and gates have gone through a variety of incarnations. Over the centuries, there have been perhaps as many as 50 different gates. They were gates named for the everyday commerce they allowed, such as the Sheep Gate, Horse Gate, and even the Water Gate. There were gates named for prophets and tribes of Israel, and there were gates named for the places to which they led. Over the centuries, new gates were cut, only to later disappear, covered by the ages. The ruins of new entrances are constantly being located during excavations in the city. For instance, in the early 1980s, work was begun to renovate the plaza inside the Muslim quarter of the old city. During construction, the remains of a magnificent second-century Roman gate were exposed. As the workmen dug further, they found Roman runes and relics from the Crusades. Still further, huge 1,000-year-old paving stones that were part of a magnificent plaza were unearthed. Many times over the centuries, the walls and gates of Old Jerusalem have protected the residents from enemies. They have allowed the people to shut themselves inside their city, locking out physical attackers. In fact, 4 of the gates, Herod's Gate, the Jaffa Gate, the Zion Gate, and the walled-up Golden Gate, have a history closely tied with physical threat from the outside. But it's the stories of the remaining 4 gates, the Lion's Gate, the New Gate, the Damascus Gate, and the Dung Gate, that are stories of the battle to win hearts and souls. First, let us look at the story of the gates that protect the spirit of the city. These are the doorways to some of history's most coveted holy sites. The Dung Gate leads us out into the Kidron Valley and takes us back to the origins of Jewish settlement in this region. While the current gate structure was built by Suleiman, the gate itself points to a history stretching far back in time, back to a point when the history of the Jewish nation and Old Jerusalem became forever entwined. It dates back nearly 1,000 years before Christ, when the Jewish King David captured the city from the Jebusites. At the time, the walled city was called Jebus and was considered one of the strongest fortresses in the area. The Jebusites were confident of their defenses, and when David led his troops on the city, they scoffed at him. But David's chief general and nephew learned of the secret tunnel to the Gihon Spring, which had been dug to protect the city's water supply. David sent his nephew Joab to find a way through the tunnel, beneath the walls, and into the city. It is believed that the shaft Joab climbed to reach the city is the one now called Warren Shaft, named after Charles Warren, a British explorer who unearthed it. Joab probably maneuvered his way through the tunnel and then up the dark, wet 43-foot shaft to surprise the unsuspecting Jebusites. Ironically, the first conquest of the walls of Jerusalem came not over, not through, but bypassed them by going under. The Israelites' young king made a spectacular entrance into his new conquest, Jerusalem. He danced through the gates with the sacred Ark of the Covenant and the tablets of the Law of Moses. The Old Testament says the Ark's entry into the city was done with much pomp and celebration. David was so excited he must have lost his head for a time. The book of 2 Samuel claims David danced before the Lord with all his might. His wild dancing embarrassed his wife, Michal, and she roundly criticized him when he returned home. But his act of bringing the ark into the city forever established Jerusalem as the center of Judaism. The city quickly became known as the City of David, and the king's influence is felt there to this day. And yes, this is the same David, the handsome young shepherd boy remembered for his stunning duel in the valley of Elah with the Philistine giant Goliath. Shunning armor, sword, and shield, young David took 5 small river stones and his sling. He slew the giant in the name of his God and the nation of Israel. Just outside Jerusalem's walls, archaeologists recently discovered the ruins of a city nearly 3,000 years old. All agree that these ruins were part of the actual city that David built. David began transforming his city into a showplace. He fortified the walls. But from the standpoint of history, his most important act was establishing the site of the future Jewish temples. David longed to build a house of God where he could place the Holy Ark. The Ark was a mobile shrine that had been the center of Jewish religious life during the 40 years they wandered through the deserts after the exodus from Egypt. After building his palace, David climbed to the highest point in the city, which was called Mount Moriah, and purchased the hilltop for 50 silver shekels from a Gittite named Obed-Edom. It had been used as the farmer's threshing floor. Plans were started for a splendid new temple. In the sacred writings of both Jewish and Christians, David is depicted as the epitome of a ruler pleasing to God. He was a statesman, a poet, a general, and a musician. All the country's rulers after that were measured by his standards. However, in 1 Chronicles, David was told by God that because he had shed much blood and fought many wars, he was not to be the person to build a new temple. Instead, his son, the wise and magnificent Solomon, would be given the task. In 970 BC, shortly before David's death at age 70, the aging king anointed his son the new king of Israel. Solomon proved to be a wise and ambitious king who brought his nation to new levels of wealth and influence. He was a visionary, a scholar, a poet, a master statesman, and an astute businessman. Solomon began enlarging the old city, bringing it approximately to the size it is today. Solomon created a large army of chariot warriors and horses, stationed along Israel's trade routes. His caravans and ships traveled the known world to bring back treasures never before seen in Israel. From India came gold and silver. From Asian ports came peacocks and apes, ivory and incense. One of Solomon's first acts was to complete a palace more spectacular than his father's. Solomon's palace astounded everyone who looked on it. Travelers reported that nothing like it had been seen in any kingdom. But Solomon was frequently given to excess, taking for himself 700 wives, mostly for political reasons, and 300 concubines, mostly for personal reasons. His saying, "Trade follows the bride," was famous throughout the empire. In Solomon's day, the population of the old city quickly doubled, and before his death, some estimates indicate it reached an incredible 25,000 people. It has only about 27,000 residents today. After building his palace with conscripted labor, Solomon then turned his attention to building the temple. 30,000 men and 7 years were required to complete this overwhelming task. The stones used in the construction of the temple were pre-finished at a quarry in the northern part of the land. In this depiction, we see what Solomon's temple may have looked like in its day. The temple grounds were bordered by as many as 12 gates. The temple was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. It contained gold, silver, bronze, cedar, pine, and other fine materials. This house for God was without equal. In fact, the blueprint can be found in the Old Testament book of Chronicles. On the outside of the temple building, or hekel, Solomon ordered 2 hollow bronze pillars cast. Each were 27 feet high and 18 feet around. Each pillar was decorated with 200 pomegranates. The entire inside, from floor to ceiling, was paneled with cedar, and the floors were made of cypress boards. The remainder of the temple, other than the room containing the Holy of Holies, was 60 feet long. The inner room of the Hekel was where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. This inner sanctuary was 30 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 30 feet high. Within the sanctuary, Solomon placed 2 statues of guardian angels made of olive wood, each 15 feet high. Tradition says they were placed so that their outspread wings reached from wall to wall, while their inner wings touched each other at the center of the room. The Ark of the Covenant was situated directly in front and below the wings of the cherubim. The veil separated the holy place from the most holy place. The veil was made of fine linen in colors of red and blue, embroidered with angels. Work on the majestic temple helped the growth and prosperity of Old Jerusalem. The wonder of the beautiful, mystical building fired the imaginations of the entire empire. From all over the ancient world, throngs streamed to Solomon's temple in wonderment. Jerusalem's reputation as a city with the sanctuary of God in its midst traveled to the ends of the earth. Religious festivals like the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles became huge events, filling the city with pilgrims. Local residents began renting out living space to visitors during festival time. Also, Jewish law called for an elaborate series of animal sacrifices at the temple. For instance, during the Feast of Tabernacles, 70 bulls were sacrificed on the temple altar. The blood and offal from the slain animals was directed down a special sewer system and moved outside the city through the dung gate. The temple remained the hub of Jewish life until time revealed how fragile Solomon's massive empire really was. When the king died in 927 BC, the kingdom again became divided into tribes. First, the 10 northern tribes broke away, forming 2 separate nations, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. 200 years later, in 722 BC, Israel was captured by the Assyrians. 100 years later, in 606 BC, the tyrannical Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar took control of Judah and the capital, Jerusalem. He became the first of several non-Jewish rulers to govern. Solomon's beautiful temple stood for nearly 400 years, until about 586 BC, when, in response to a revolt, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the city plundered and the sacred temple burned. The looting and pillaging were so complete that, except for a tiny vase now on display in the Israel Museum, none of the temple artifacts have ever surfaced. In approximately 700 BC, about 100 years before Cyrus was born, the prophet Isaiah foretold that a king named Cyrus would make it possible for the temple to be rebuilt after Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it. With the patronage of Cyrus, the temple was slated for reconstruction. The materials and workmanship never equaled the first temple built by King Solomon, but for the Jewish people, there was hope for another temple. Cyrus can best be judged as a righteous Gentile by the Jewish people. His contributions were high-minded in an era when rampage and pillage were the norms. Finally, in 536 BC, a smaller temple was started on the foundation of Solomon's temple by the Jewish leader Zerubbabel. Nearly 500 years passed before true pomp and spectacle returned to the Temple Mount. Herod the Great, an Idumean, was made king by the Romans. Herod was a descendant of Esau, the son of Isaac. Isaac also fathered Jacob. Before Herod was born, his family was forced to convert to Judaism. However, he was never accepted or respected by his Jewish subjects. The new King Herod was one of the most complex and unpredictable leaders ever to rule the Jewish state. Herod could be a generous benefactor and builder one day and a paranoid, sadistic killer the next. He murdered his own wife, and in an effort to stop the prophesied birth of a new Jewish Messiah, he once ordered the execution of all boys under the age of 2 who were born in Bethlehem. The Roman Emperor Octavius once remarked, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." But his reign was a time of stability and wealth in Israel. He began financing improvements in the infrastructure of the city, building magnificent new palaces and citadels. He built the largest port in the ancient world, Caesarea, and completed an elaborate water storage system all across the nation. Perhaps remembering the financial benefits of Solomon's temple, Herod began expanding and refurbishing the old temple structure. He started the work about 20 years before the birth of Christ. The resulting temple was about twice the size of Solomon's. It required 10,000 builders. Herod tried to do everything by the book, so when it came time to build the Holy of Holies, he had 1,000 priests trained in masonry, so no unclean hands would touch the sacred walls. The construction took about 46 years to complete. At this point, the Temple Mount encompassed about 35 acres. Herod created vast porticos around the huge courtyard and linked the temple area to the city by a series of bridges and staircases. Records indicate that the new temple was opulent to the extreme. Nearly every metal fitting was plated with gold and silver. The stone exterior was a brilliant white with blue highlights that could be seen by pilgrims from distant hills. As the temple progressed, the city continued to attract people. According to some estimates, the old city population grew to more than 150,000 people. At festival time, more than 1 million people would gather within Jerusalem's walls. Many wealthy citizens began investing in elaborate mansions near the temple to rent up during festivals. Such mansions, recently excavated under Jerusalem's Jewish quarter, had elaborate tile floors, huge pillared courtyards, and beautiful ritual baths called mikvahs. People ascended to the Temple Mount by a wide staircase. Money changers would exchange foreign currency for shekels, the only money accepted in the temple. Each pilgrim was required to pay for at least one animal sacrifice. Pens of sacrificial animals were kept on the temple grounds. There were courtyards set aside for Gentiles and for women. However, both had to move around with care because if they strayed beyond their prescribed area, they could be severely punished. Gentiles were warned not to stray too close to the holy sites upon pain of death. Solomon's temple contained the Ark of the Covenant and the tablets of the law, but in Herod's day the Holy of Holies was empty. The sacred artifacts from Solomon's day disappeared after the carnage and destruction of the Babylonian invasion. Even without the Ark and other sacred items, the new temple proved to be very popular, and the pace of ritual slaughtering increased dramatically. At festival times, visitors were overwhelmed by the number of animal sacrifices performed by priests, often thousands each day. But like the earlier temple, Herod's edifice ended up as a timeless ruin on the Temple Mount. In about 69 AD, Titus, the son of Roman Emperor Vespasian, marched on Jerusalem with a 65,000-man army. He was sent to suppress a Jewish rebellion against Roman oppression, but the revolt failed miserably. After a long siege, Jerusalem fell, and Titus torched the entire city. The beautiful temple went up in flames. While the first and second temples are now rubble and ashes, the masses of pilgrims still have reason to pass through the Dung Gate on their way to the western wall. This 50-foot stone block retaining wall was once a part of the actual temple complex. Some of its stones actually date back to the time of Herod the Great. Although the prayers here often take on the form of chanting and even singing, most Jewish people prefer to call this site the Western Wall, as opposed to the Wailing Wall, as a travel writer once called it. On this holy ground, the Jewish people come to mourn the loss of their empire. They mourn the cities of David and Solomon, and the destruction of their temple on the mount just above this wall. Here they can contemplate the many hardships they have endured throughout their history, from exile to Holocaust. They can pray for the return of the glory of their ancient past. The Western Wall is treated as a synagogue. Men must cover their heads. The Torah is read aloud on Monday and Thursday mornings, and bar mitzvahs are a common sight on Saturdays. No trees can be planted in the courtyard as long as the third and final temple remains unbuilt. The wall area is divided into two sections, one for women and one for men. The ancient custom of leaving petitions inside the cracks of the wall has been renewed. It is now possible to fax your prayer to the Western Wall from anywhere in the world. Requests left between the huge Roman stones of the wall are supposed to get special attention from God. As the only part of the temple complex to survive the Roman destruction, the wall has been revered by Jewish believers for nearly 1900 years. The plaza in front of the Western Wall was opened 3 days after the Israelis captured this part of the old city from the Jordanians in June 1967. 600 shanties housing North African Muslims were bulldozed to make way for a space that would accommodate the tens of thousands of worshippers whose dream has always been to pray in Jerusalem. In the first few weeks after the Western Wall was reopened, more than 500,000 people made a pilgrimage to see it. Jewish believers are joyful with these trips to the wall. However, Orthodox rules forbid the Jewish faithful from visiting the area of the Temple Mount, because the exact site of the sacred Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary of the Old Temple, has not as yet been found. Only the high priest was allowed to set foot on the ground beneath the Holy of Holies, and then only once a year. So the fear is that believers entering the area might accidentally walk across the Holy of Holies, violating one of the most sacred of Jewish laws. Jewish believers approach the wall with care. Men go to the left, women to the right. When they leave, as an act of reverence, they back away, still facing the sacred wall. They never wish to turn their backs to a place so holy and sacred. The wall serves as a center of Jewish social life, and all manner of important state and religious ceremonies take place there. Even army recruits are sworn in at the wall. So, despite the loss of the temples, the Dung Gate has managed to retain its position as a guidepost for Israel's religious life. The Western Wall has gates of its own. Some lead into prayer areas. Others lead to tunnels below the wall. Here, deep underground, it is possible to find more ancient gates leading to the Temple Mount. Most of the alleyways are long, narrow, and straight, conforming to the Roman grid pattern set up after Jerusalem's complete destruction by Emperor Hadrian after a Jewish revolt in 135 AD. Hadrian believed, as did many in the Roman Empire of the 2nd century, that Jerusalem was an ungovernable place which would never know peace. Jewish interests and Roman interests were completely at odds, and had been for centuries. The Romans saw the Jewish people as locked into an ancient and unworkable code of laws, thousands of years old and entirely out of keeping with modern life. The Jews saw the Romans as egomaniacal colonizers, with a seductive modern culture which would pollute, alter, and ultimately destroy the purity of Jewish religious practice. After a series of upstart Jewish revolts and violent reprisals by the Roman authorities, the decision was made to start over again in Jerusalem from the ground up. Under Hadrian, the city was completely razed to the ground, renamed and rebuilt. the Jewish community was evicted and not allowed to return. A whole new city, called Aelia Capitolina, was laid out under the Roman plan. It is from this time that we begin to see the shape and form of today's Old City of Jerusalem beginning to emerge. Straight boulevards were laid out in grid form across the city. The main road, running roughly from today's Damascus Gate to the Dung Gate, was called the Cardo and was the main axis of the city. The Forum, or marketplace, was located along this main avenue, and some of the arched stalls dating back 2,000 years have recently been excavated and are visible along the Cardo today. Parts of this ancient Roman street have been preserved, roofed over, and modified. The Cardo has now become a modern tourist arcade. It even boasts a Roman version of a famous department store amongst its many art shops and galleries, Herod's. Old Jerusalem is a city that has learned to live with divisions. Its ethnic populations have separated themselves into clear-cut communities. In fact, two of the main city streets, David Street running east to west, and Souk Khan Izit Street from north to south, divide this ancient community into four clear sections: the Christian quarter in the northwest, the Armenian quarter in the southwest, the Jewish quarter in the southeast, and finally, the Muslim quarter in the northeast. The beautiful Damascus Gate gets its name from having been the traditional starting point for travelers planning to go to the city of Damascus, the ancient capital of the Muslim state of Syria. The gate is easily the most regal of all the city's gates. There is a well-preserved ancient Arabic inscription over the gate announcing, "There is no God but God, and Mohammed is his prophet." It is the first hint of what visitors are about to see. The Damascus Gate is the most direct entry into the large Muslim quarter of Old Jerusalem. The gate is always busy, especially at noon on Fridays, when huge crowds of Muslims make their way from the El-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount to their homes outside the walls in East Jerusalem. They are returning from personal prayers and the gathering of the congregation in the central mosque. They will usually be making their way home in the hot midday sun that always seems to be beating down in the old city. This opens the door for the water sellers, who have been plying their trade near the Damascus Gate since earliest times. They make a few coins, providing cool drinks. The Damascus Gate also goes by other names. The Jewish community calls it the Shechem Gate, and Muslims refer to it as the Column Gate, because the gate structure contains a column from which early travelers calculated the distance to Damascus. Near the gate is a flight of steps which leads up to a pathway on top of the wall called the Ramparts Walk. Suleiman, the wall builder, obviously had important visitors in mind when he built the dramatic Damascus Gate. He flanked the gate with two towers and covered the top with impressive decorative battlements. Visiting leaders passing through the gate were impressed both with the beauty and the defensive posture of the city. Entering the Damascus Gate, one quickly understands he has entered the world of Islam. Muslims came to Jerusalem in about 638 AD and have been an important part of the old city's character and culture ever since. In fact, the city was in the hands of various Muslim dynasties for more than 450 years, before it was briefly captured by Christian crusaders. It was quickly retaken by Muslim armies and was held for another 600 years after that. In 1494, one Christian pilgrim wrote of his visit, "Each one who goes on the voyage to the sepulchre of our Lord has need of 3 sacks, a sack of patience, a sack of money, and a sack of faith." One of the greatest contributions of the Muslim empires was the invention of new and distinctive styles of architecture. The Mamelukes in the 14th century were famous for their beautiful red, white, and black stone architecture, including the magnificent Bab el Karanin Gate on the Temple Mount. The Mameluke dominion of the Old City ended in 1516, when the Ottoman Turks took over. Muhammad taught that his first connection with Jerusalem happened when he was awakened by the angel Gabriel in Mecca, who removed and washed Muhammad's heart and instructed him to take an evening journey to the farthest place, which is widely understood to be Jerusalem. While there, he visited all the holy places and met Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and other prophets at the Temple Mount. From the rock in the center of the Temple Mount, Muhammad climbed a ladder of light through 7 heavens. He appeared before Allah, who instructed him about prayer. Shortly after Muhammad's death in 632, his successors began rapidly spreading their faith beyond their Arab home. At that time, Jerusalem was ruled by Roman and Byzantine conquerors. In about 638, the Muslims, under Caliph Omar, moved on the city, and after a 4-month siege, took control. The most dramatic evidence of the long Muslim presence in Jerusalem is the exquisite Dome of the Rock, which still stands in the middle of the old Temple Mount. The Muslims refer to the dome as the most holy sanctuary. The Dome of the Rock was built in the year 691 by Caliph Abdul al-Malik, the 9th successor to the Prophet Muhammad. His desire was to erect a building which would rival in beauty the Christian churches of Byzantine Jerusalem. Al-Malik could see the popularity of Christian holy sites in attracting pilgrims. He wished to offer a majestic holy site to Muslim pilgrims, perhaps in hopes of luring them away from the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca. The Caliph hired Byzantine Christian architects to design the 8-sided structure. Al-Malik covered the sacred monument with tile mosaics, rubies, and semi-precious stones. The interior was also covered with radiant gold mosaics, the work of Syrian Christians. On the outer and inner walls, words from the Quran were written in elaborate calligraphy, a major Muslim contribution to the arts of the region. Even today, the outside of the dome is a paint box of colors, capped by a gold-plated aluminum dome that dominates the old city skyline. Curved pillars at the top of the monument steps are, according to Muslim tradition, scales where the souls of all mankind will be weighed on Judgment Day. This building is enormous. Its octagon base is about 180 feet in diameter. The dome is about 78 feet across, and the whole structure rises about 108 feet into the air. Perhaps realizing the religious fervor once generated by the Hebrew temples, Al-Malik took the controversial step of building his Muslim holy place directly on the Jewish temple site. He chose the cradle of all Western religion, Mount Moriah, as the home of his new holy site. Somewhere under Al-Malik's dome, no one seems to know exactly where, is the area consecrated by the Jewish people as the Holy of Holies, the very center of their religious universe. Inside the dome can be found a huge boulder that has religious significance for both the Muslim and Jewish faithful. Many Jewish faithful are sure the so-called Rock of the Foundation, or Rock of Moriah, is the exact site where 4,000 years ago Abraham is said to have prepared to sacrifice Isaac before receiving instructions from God to spare his son. Perhaps from this very stone, one of the great ideas in the history of man was born. The idea that all men have descended from only one God, one Creator. It is a belief which has transcended time, place, and generation. And it's a belief that has made Jerusalem the world's great religious center. The dome is sometimes referred to as the Mosque of Omar, which is incorrect, since it is neither a mosque nor was it built by Caliph Omar, who predated the structure. The Dome of the Rock is an ornamental shrine. The true mosque on the Temple Mount is nearby El-Aqsa, and it is the place to pray. It is Israel's largest mosque. Jerusalem is Islam's third holiest place, behind Mecca, Muhammad's birthplace, and Medina, the location of his tomb. Al-Aqsa's silver-capped Muslim holy place serves as a prayer hall and can accommodate as many as 5,000 worshippers. The mosque has been renovated and restored a number of times over the years. Obviously, because of the location and the general explosiveness of the world around them, the dome and the mosque have long been a place where passions become easily inflamed. In 1951, a Muslim fanatic murdered Jordan's King Abdullah near the mosque. In 1969, an unstable Australian set fire to the mosque, causing heavy damage and increasing calls for a holy war against Israel. But the holy site has also been a place of peace. In 1977, former Egyptian President Anwar Sadat prayed at the mosque. Today, masses of the faithful still crowd through the quiet, sunny plazas that surround the mosque. Then, just as they came, most of these devoted followers wind their way back through the Damascus Gate, past the old city walls, and into the secular world from whence they came. One can be certain that any time, day or night, somewhere in Old Jerusalem, someone will be praying. The intensity of the religious ardor in this tiny city can sometimes be overwhelming. In the Jewish quarter, the sound of the shofar can be heard coming from the western wall. In the Muslim quarter, the daily call to prayer of the muezzin echoes from the mosque. And from the Christian and Armenian quarters, entreaties can be heard coming from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Christian prayers aren't new to Old Jerusalem. In fact, some of the most dramatic moments in the life of the creator of the Christian faith, Jesus of Nazareth, were played out on the streets of the old city. Jesus and his first converts were Jewish, with close ties to the sacred temple. The gates most closely associated with the life of Jesus and the early Christians are the New Gate and the Lion's Gate, also known as St. Stephen's Gate. The New Gate is the closest physical entrance to the Christian quarter of the city. The New Gate was the last of the current gates to be constructed and was built in 1896 by the Sultan Abdul Hamid. It is a subtle and easily overlooked entrance and offers little when compared to the magnificent Damascus Gate nearby. But to many in this century, it symbolizes the first Christian efforts to spread the teachings of Jesus, the itinerant Jewish preacher and carpenter's son. Christians throughout the world have always had a strong interest in Old Jerusalem, primarily because Jesus' ministry and death were so closely tied to the city. Christians expect Jerusalem to play a major role in the events that lead to the end of the age. Immediately south of the Christian quarter is a group of about 2,000 Armenians who live in a tightly knit community known as the Armenian Quarter. It is the smallest ethnic community in the city. The Armenians take pride in being some of the earliest of Christian converts and occupants of Jerusalem. In about 70 AD, Armenian soldiers apparently came to Israel under Titus. They were among the first to hear the Christian teachings, and they were converted in large numbers. The Armenian community in Old Jerusalem began to develop sometime in the middle of the 3rd century. So, long before Christian pilgrims began arriving from Western Europe, thousands of Armenians had already settled in the Holy Land. Over the years, the Armenians have generally been able to steer clear of the violence that frequently breaks out in Jerusalem. Perhaps it is that skill to escape violence that brought many of the last Armenian residents to the old city. Many in the Armenian community follow their own religion, which is referred to as the Gregorian faith. It differs from Orthodox Christianity in that it rejected the official doctrine upheld by the Council of Chalcedon that the incarnate Christ had two natures, divine and human. Such a doctrine, the Armenians claimed, divided Christ into two persons. The holiest place to Armenians is Mount Ararat, the sacred mountain where Noah's Ark came to rest. The symbol of Ararat is represented by the distinctive pointed hats worn by Armenian priests. For hundreds of years, Christians were barred from sounding bells across the Holy Land. They were considered a distraction and interference with Muslim prayer calls, and an unpleasant memory of the Crusader era. When bells arrived at the port of Jaffa, Arab workmen often refused to unload them from the ships. In several cases, religious pilgrims crated and hauled the bells themselves. Even today in Armenian Christian churches, wood clackers are used instead of bells to summon the faithful to prayer, a holdover from Saladin's edict 800 years ago. The strong spiritual tie that both Christians and Armenians feel toward the Old City goes back into the history of the lovely Lion's Gate, or St. Stephen's Gate, near the Temple Mount. The Lion's Gate actually opens into the Muslim section of the city, but its long-standing historical tie to the life and death of Christ gives it special meaning to Christians. The lions, from which it got its name, are actually a pair of spectacular carved beasts put there by Suleiman the Magnificent. Legend has it that the idea of two lions came to Suleiman a dream, threatening to tear him to pieces if he didn't repair and rebuild the walls of Old Jerusalem. The dream spurred him to restore the walls and gates to some of their former glory. The gate's other name, St. Stephen's Gate, was given by the early Christian Crusaders, who wanted to rename it after the first Christian martyr, St. Stephen. During the time of Jesus, another major gate is believed to have been located right at or near the Lion's Gate. This so-called Sheep Gate was named for the sheep baths that were located nearby. The analogy to sheep is poignant because many Christian historians believe that Jesus' last entry into the city of Jerusalem was made through the Sheep Gate. Jesus' encounters with the city of Jerusalem were always dramatic ones. The Christian Bible teaches that the young Jesus astounded the priests at the temple with his knowledge of the holy books. His last entry into Jerusalem began with a celebration. His followers threw branches in front of his mount as he rode into the city, and they shouted, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The pre-Easter Christian holiday of Palm Sunday celebrates this entry. After Jesus entered the city, he went to Herod's beautiful temple. He became angry when he saw money changers polluting the court of the Gentiles, profiting from those who were buying sacrificial animals. He angered the Jewish religious leaders when he stormed through the temple's court of Gentiles, angrily overturning the money tables and running off the money changers. Just inside the current Lion's Gate, the crucifixion of Christ is brought into vivid detail along the street called the Via Dolorosa. There, marked along the narrow Roman street, are the so-called Stations of the Cross, commemorating the places Jesus passed on his way to Golgotha. The last 7 stations are inside one of the most holy of Christian sites, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The current building dates from the 12th century and is one of the oldest standing buildings in Jerusalem. Many additions have been added over the centuries. 6 rival Christian sects jealously guard their portion of the Holy Sepulchre, sometimes to the detriment of maintenance and cleaning. After a 1927 earthquake damaged the structure, it took 32 years for the Roman Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Armenians, Syrians, Copts, and Ethiopians to come to an agreement as to how to proceed with repairs. Left out of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre are the Protestants. Some of them claim a separate burial site for Jesus, the Garden Tomb near the central bus station in East Jerusalem, not far from the Damascus Gate. They argue that a large rock nearby looks decidedly like Golgotha, which means skull, the rock upon which Jesus was said to be crucified. The rock appears to have a face looking directly at you. The tomb at this site would have been located outside the city walls, as required by Jewish law. The Holy Sepulchre, which is located within the city, might not have been the original place of his burial. However, the Protestants emphasize that geography is unimportant, since after all, Jesus has risen and cannot be absolutely identified with any specific site. Every Friday, crowds of Christians gather at the house of Caiaphas, the former high priest in Jerusalem who played a key role in Christ's crucifixion, to begin a pilgrimage on the Via Dolorosa. Many of these holy sites, celebrated by pilgrims today, owe their existence to the work of a bishop and a Roman queen who located and protected them. Early in the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. He had been converted to Christianity by his mother, Queen Helena, who had come to her faith late in life. Constantine was dramatically changed by his new religious commitment. He credited all his military victories to his new religion and became zealous in his desire to spread the faith. Pilgrims began demanding to see exact sites of sacred events, but no one really knew where most of these biblical events actually took place. In 325 A.D., Bishop Macarius of Jerusalem convinced Queen Helena to come to the Holy Land to officially determine the sites in the life and crucifixion of Jesus. The holy sites had been neglected for some time. Using intuition and logic, Bishop Macarius and Queen Helena identified many of the Bible's holy places. Queen Helena even claimed to have found the original cross and nails used in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. She also established 50 holy sites on the Mount of Olives. Just inside the Lion's Gate, pilgrims can visit the site of the birthplace of the Virgin Mary at St. Anne's Crusader Church. Nearby are the Bethesda pools, where Jesus healed an invalid paralyzed for 38 years. Venturing outside the Lion's Gate, worshippers discover the Mount of Olives. It was on this hill, some 2,000 years ago, that Jesus and his disciples walked. The Mosque of Ascension on the top of the mountain is a rare Muslim site which recognizes Jesus. From this spot, Jesus is thought to have ascended to heaven 40 days after the resurrection. Inside this humble building is what many believe is a footprint of Jesus. Nearby, at the Church of Pater Noster, is the site where Jesus is believed to have taught his disciples the Lord's Prayer. To celebrate the event, the Crusaders built a church and have placed on the walls the Lord's Prayer in 60 different languages. At the Church of Dominus Flevit, pilgrims can find the very stone upon which Jesus is said to have wept for Jerusalem. The church is built in the shape of a teardrop, symbolizing Christ's pity. The view through the stained glass window is one of the majestic sights in the country. Down the hill in Gethsemane is the location of the garden where Jesus prayed, was betrayed, and was arrested. Under these ancient olive trees, he once sat and taught his disciples. The site of the betrayal of Jesus by Judas Iscariot is marked by the Church of All Nations, built in 1924. Looming over the Mount of Olives is one of the most beautiful churches in Jerusalem. These are the onion domes of the Russian Orthodox Church, built by Tsar Alexander III in 1888. But are these really the locations where these events took place? It's hard to know. While these were dramatic events at the time, it was still more than 300 years later when Queen Helena began trying to locate the actual sites. Archaeologists tell us that some of the sites don't seem to correspond with the historical record, while others do. But to most faithful pilgrims, physical proof isn't the point. For as you see, the most important bond that holds together the communities of Old Jerusalem is faith. The holy ground inside these gates must first be entered through the heart. For the Jewish people who inherited this land from time immemorial, the old city of Jerusalem is sacred. It is their beloved home. It is the site of their ancient temple. But life goes on in the ancient walled city. Believers of all faiths are called to prayer. Pilgrims and the devout enter the gates to the city of peace. Some find no peace, but the peace is there, somewhere within the gates of time. This is the city where history began, and where, many believe, history will end.
Thank you for joining me for the Gates of Time, a 3,000-year journey through the history of Jerusalem. I'm Richard Kiley. I'll see you again. There are cities that time has forgotten, and there are cities which time can never forget. Throughout history, there have been many holy cities and many places of legend. But this is the city where history began, and some believe the city where history will end. This is Jerusalem. And the story is told here, the story of God and the story of man. It's a city of conquerors and empires which have long since faded from memory. It's a city of wonders and miracles which could have, over time, been forgotten if they had not been kept alive by faith and the Scriptures. It's a city which has been completely destroyed dozens of times. And through it all, through the rich and diverse history which has stretched over 3,000 years, Jerusalem has survived. It remains the center of the world's faith. And because it's a city of the Spirit, it has aroused in its conquerors a lust for control that no amount of material treasure could ever satisfy. It has aroused in its pilgrims a desire to see what no other destination could ever match. In the first hour of the program, we explored Jerusalem's troubled history as the holiest site in the Jewish faith. We've seen an array of historical figures march through the gates, from King David to King Solomon to Alexander the Great to King Herod. Please join me now as we continue our journey through the gates of time, the story of the 8 gates of Jerusalem.
Today, Jerusalem's walls are actually breached by 7 working gates, and one gate that was purposely closed nearly 1,300 years ago. The obstructed gate is the beautiful Golden Gate, an entrance that was sealed off by Muslim conquerors, determined to stop the prophesied entry into the city by a Jewish Messiah. This gate remains clearly visible in the city walls, waiting for the dramatic events millions believe will precede the end of the world. In our first hour, we looked at the 4 gates that open to the spirit of the city, the gates most closely tied to Jerusalem's varied and contentious religious life. We traveled through the New Gate and the Lion's Gate, commonly used by the Christians who live in and travel to Jerusalem. The Lion's Gate in particular opens onto the sacred Via Dolorosa, the street Jesus walked to his crucifixion. The Damascus Gate, a beautiful structure now used by the masses of Muslim faithful heading to prayer at the mosque and holy sites on the Temple Mount. And the fascinating Gate, which allows Jewish worshippers to walk to their most holy site, the Western Wall. Here, the Orthodox can be heard praying that the Jewish temple, which once graced this site, will someday be rebuilt. But there are three gates that tell the story of the warring and bloodshed that threaten Jerusalem even to this day. Gates that can tell stories of conflict and conquerors. This is the Zion Gate. It is scarred and pocked with Jordanian bullet holes. This gate bore the brunt of the conflict outside the city walls during the Six-Day War. Through the Jaffa Gate, recent European conquerors and foreign ideas forced their way into the city. And Herod's Gate. Here, 12th century crusaders surmounted the walls of the old city in their effort to wrest Jerusalem from Muslim control. The words are everywhere. In everyone's mind and on the tip of every tongue. The words are from the Bible. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. It has been a city that kings and rulers have longed to possess. Almost all have come from the north to stake their claim. David, Solomon, Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander the Great, Caesar, Herod, Suleiman the Magnificent, and Napoleon. How could so much blood be shed and so much misery inflicted over a city with almost no natural resources? No river access, no seaport, and far from any important trade route. What has made this city valuable in the eyes of almost all who have come here is not material riches or natural resources. It is, in one word, God. Throughout history, the world has believed that these are God's chosen hills. Some believe that by entering one of the stone gates of Jerusalem, the chosen are as close to God as they will ever be on this earth. In the book of Psalms, a poet sang of his love for the city. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I prefer not Jerusalem above my highest joys. Herod's Gate, called the Flower Gate in Arabic, is in the northeastern part of the city. Today it is an entrance into the Muslim quarter of the old city. The least impressive and most easily overlooked gate, it has witnessed the most spectacular invasions of Jerusalem. Herod's Gate is a structure that dates back to the 16th century, when the Turkish ruler Suleiman the Magnificent began rebuilding the city's walls and infrastructure. Herod's Gate now leads through a narrow layer of shops and homes of the Muslim quarter. There are some indications that earlier gates at this location might have led to the land of the Jewish tribes, Ephraim, and therefore might have been called the Ephraim Gate. But this cut in the old wall was later named for Herod the Great, who rebuilt the sacred Jewish temple shortly before the birth of Christ. Herod's Gate's only liability is that it faces north, the direction from which Jerusalem's enemies seem to come. The idea that trouble often comes from the north wasn't a new concept for early residents of this ancient city. In fact, 600 years before the birth of Christ, the Jewish prophet Jeremiah predicted violent attacks from the north. For his unpopular predictions, Jeremiah's writings were burned, and he was banished to a cave, which is believed to be only a short distance from what is now Herod's Gate. The old prophet continued his writing and prophesying of future wars and pestilence, even after he was banished. In the old Jerusalem book that carries his name, Jeremiah predicted, "For disaster looms out of the north, even terrible destruction. And he was right. Over the walls near Herod's gate came Nebuchadnezzar, banishing all in his wake. Over these walls came Titus to completely destroy Jewish civilization. Over these walls came Christian crusaders, unleashing the worst killing spree Jerusalem has ever known. And over these stones came Saladin, Sultan of Egypt, to drive out the Christians. Standing in the gates of Jerusalem, Jeremiah cut off his hair and cast it away, and predicted that all gladness and mirth would fail this city, and Jerusalem would be desolate. From the north they came, burning, pillaging, killing, and exiling. Alexander the Great walked through the gates of Jerusalem in 334 BC, not as a conqueror, but as a friend. Alexander, according to tradition, was greeted by the Jewish leaders and told how his arrival had been prophesied by Daniel. Alexander was so impressed he did not overthrow Jerusalem. He and the Greek Empire, which succeeded him, brought a new invasion of Western values to the city. Alexander the Great believed in a one-world civilization, a brotherhood of man in which all people were united in a similar cultural practice. It was an enlightened idea for its time, but it did not sit well with traditional Jewish faith. The Greeks were, for the most part, tolerant of many cultural practices of the people in their empire, and for a considerable time, Jewish and Greek colonies lived side by side in Jerusalem without much disagreement. Greece was an admired empire, exporting a way of life that was highly seductive to the young people of Jerusalem. Many Jews were taken in by the modern, cosmopolitan ways of the Greeks and readily integrated with them. Greek culture was an awesome force, and most educated Jews found it irresistible. The Greeks were magnificent architects, and they excelled in poetry, philosophy, theater, and other arts. As traders, none had matched them for 1,000 years. Greek culture, or Hellenism as it was known, promised Judea a glorious future, but it also threatened to destroy Judea. Slowly but surely, Jerusalem was transformed into a Hellenic city, adapting Greek lifestyles and institutions. But Greek culture was full of excesses, supported by mythology for its spiritual direction. To protect themselves from this polluting influence, the Jews began to put up walls and barriers to keep their culture separate from the Greeks. In response, the Greeks issued the first anti-Semitic writings during this era. Slowly, tensions began developing between these two cultures. When the Syrian Emperor Antiochus Epiphanes came to power, things became worse. Antiochus wanted the entire empire to be more Hellenic, seeing the Jewish faith as ancient, backward, and an embarrassment to his vision for a glorious empire. Antiochus banned circumcision and recognition of the Sabbath. He renamed Jerusalem Antiochia. A Greek gymnasium was built at the base of the Temple Mount, where uncircumcised naked men performed exercises in public. This event alone shocked and deeply offended the conservative Jewish community. Antiochus ordered the rebuilt Second Temple to be converted into a shrine to Zeus, the ultimate Greek god. Antiochus humiliated all of Israel when he sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple. He boiled its remains and poured the broth over the sacred vessels, defiling and desecrating everything in the temple. The Jewish community of Jerusalem was now faced with three options. Some converted to worshiping the Greek gods. Others continued to practice circumcision and observance of the Sabbath away from the eyes of the authorities. A third group faced honorable death by openly defying Hellenism. Sensing that the Jewish community was stubbornly and openly flaunting him, Antiochus stormed through the gates of Jerusalem like a wild beast and massacred young and old. He killed an estimated 40,000 people and sacked the temple, carrying off gold worth millions. In response to Greek repression, a revolt was launched in 167 BC. The Jews began a national war of resistance against the Syrians. It was led by Matthias and his 5 sons from the house of Hasmon, also known as the Maccabees, which means hammerer. They led a guerrilla war attacking from the hills surrounding Jerusalem, hammering their Syrian oppressors. 3 years later, the desecrated temple was captured and reconsecrated by the Maccabees. They destroyed the image of Zeus and cleansed the temple, restoring and sanctifying it for worship. After taking the temple, the Maccabees discovered that the temple's light had only 1 day's supply of oil. It would take 8 days to prepare more oil. The temple menorah had to be lit always. Miraculously, as legend tells us, the fire and the oil lasted for 8 days until a new supply of oil could be ready. This event is commemorated in the story of Hanukkah, which means dedication, or also the Festival of Lights. On this day, Jewish people all around the world light candles on a special menorah designed for this purpose. The menorah is the symbol of the nation of Israel. Some of the bloodiest and most constant fighting swept down on the area when the Crusades began, late in the 11th century. Ruling Turks restricted travel to Jerusalem and to the holy sites. A trip to the Holy Land was often imposed as a penance on Roman Catholic worshippers of the day. Christians, who believed a pilgrimage to the Holy Land was a religious duty, grew more and more angry with the Turks. Jerusalem had been under Muslim control since the 7th century, when, not long after the death of Muhammad, the Arab caliphs moved into Jerusalem and conquered the old city. Initially, the Arab invaders were tolerant of other faiths. For a period, Jews and Christians had relatively free access to the holy sites. But in 1071 AD, control of Jerusalem passed from the Egyptians to the Turks. They were less tolerant and restricted access to many of Jerusalem's holy places. They were even believed to have desecrated many of the sacred sites. Pope Urban II gave a speech at the Council of Clermont in France in 1095, calling on the Christians to do their moral duty to save the holy places. He called for volunteers to retake Jerusalem. Shouting their battle cry, "God wills it," thousands took up the Crusader cross and set out for Jerusalem. The first Crusaders were ill-trained and poorly armed, and the expeditions were under-financed. But a short time later, a better-equipped army of French and Norman knights joined forces in Constantinople. Launching savage battles, Crusaders captured Antioch in 1098 AD. And finally overwhelmed Jerusalem in 1099 AD. The Crusaders' siege of the city lasted nearly 40 days, and thousands were slaughtered. When the Crusaders finally breached the north wall and stormed the city, they butchered most of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Even those who had fled to their mosques or synagogues for protection were not spared. Rulers of the new Kingdom of Jerusalem began taking steps to protect the holy sites and visiting pilgrims. The well-known Order of the Knights Templar was founded in about 1119 AD. These soldiers, in their white cloaks decorated with a red Maltese cross, traveled the land protecting the faithful. Today, the sacred Al-Aqsa Mosque of the Muslims is believed to rest on an area once important to the Knights Templar. The Knights got their name from the former courtyard of Solomon's Temple, which they converted to their headquarters. Legend has it that an underground building beneath the courtyard once stabled Solomon's horses. Later, the knights also used it to protect their horses. The Crusaders converted the beautiful Muslim holy place, the Dome of the Rock, to a Christian shrine. They called it Templum Domini. To this day, a grillwork put in place by the Crusaders protects the huge holy rock in the center of the dome from visitors who want to touch the stone. Muslim forces under the Egyptian Sultan Saladin regained control of the city in 1187. When Saladin arrived, the Jewish pilgrims also began returning to the city en masse, being less afraid of the Turks than of the Crusaders. By 1190, there was again a sizable Jewish community behind the city walls. In fact, in 1211 AD, a journey to the old city by about 300 French and English rabbis was graciously allowed by the Muslim rulers. However, during this period, the old walls of the city were torn down. The Muslim rulers wanted the city as open as possible to discourage any future Crusader initiatives. Jerusalem was now open to all comers. But in 1250 AD, Jerusalem fell into the hands of another Muslim group known as the Mamelukes. These former slaves began gaining power in Egypt in the late 13th century. These hardline Muslims took Jerusalem from Saladin's armies and once again began closing the city, establishing it as a holy Muslim site. During this occupation, neither Jews nor Christians were allowed on the Temple Mount. Various military and religious leaders across Europe managed to organize a few later crusades. However, these efforts never had the enthusiasm of those early attempts to protect the holy sites of Jerusalem. And thankfully, by the late 13th century, the Crusades became a bad memory. Today, most Christian leaders agree that the Crusades were a serious error and resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. Their effects continue to influence the world to this day. Those holy quests hardened Muslim attitudes toward Christians and began raising doubts in the minds of lay people everywhere about the total authority of the Christian Church. But a few positive things did happen. The Crusades prompted otherwise isolated people to learn about different cultures and religions. And they began casting doubt on the well-established idea of religious conversion by force. However, one of the last Crusades was led by Frederick II of Germany. He took charge of the Sixth Crusade to Jerusalem in 1228 and was ousted by the Turkish mercenary Quartzamian in 1244. After Frederick's departure, except for a brief period from 1248 through 1254, Jerusalem would not see Christian rule for nearly 700 years. Early rulers always kept the Jaffa Gate locked from sunset to dawn. Those needing to enter the city before the gate was opened could often be seen lowering themselves over the wall with ropes. On Fridays, the iron gates were locked at noontime to ensure no infidel would take over the city while the Muslims were at prayer. Jewish visitors who saw Jerusalem for the first time through the Jaffa Gate were required to tear their clothes as a sign of mourning for their loss of the city of David. A rabbi was stationed at the gate to supervise this task. The Jaffa Gate, along with the Damascus Gate, are the two main entrances into the Old City. The gate is one of the most important openings through the walls because it is the main link between Old Jerusalem and the New City to the west. Each day, masses of people intent on commerce or spiritual fulfillment march through this gate. Facing west, the Jaffa Gate traditionally marked the start of the old road to Jaffa, which is a Mediterranean port city about 40 miles away. The traffic through the gate began growing in the middle part of the 19th century, when a second city began developing outside the walls. Traditionally, residents were leery of leaving the protection of their walls. Only a few, if any, settlements could ever be found outside Old Jerusalem. But as the old city began to decline from within, a few brave souls began looking to the open areas outside the Jaffa Gate. The father of the new city that emerged was an Englishman of Jewish descent, Sir Moses Montefiore. The son of a wealthy merchant, Montefiore became a generous philanthropist, with a yen to make dramatic changes in the lives of Jerusalem. Montefiore came to the old city as a tourist in the mid-19th century. He was appalled by the dirty and diseased conditions inside the city walls. He took as a personal cause an effort to improve the quality of life of the residents by moving them into new settlements outside the city. In 1854, he began building a neighborhood across the valley from the Jaffa Gate known as the Mishkanot Shah Ananim. To supply cheap flour for future tenants, Montefiore imported a huge windmill from England, which was brought to Jerusalem piece by piece on the backs of camels. Strange that a European windmill should come to symbolize the suburbanization of Jerusalem. At first, no one came to Montefiore's neighborhoods. They dared not live like this, exposed to harm and persecution, in the wilderness outside the city walls. The workers at Montefiore's cotton factory and windmill proved to be a bickering, lazy, and divided lot. It has been said that some rival Jewish workers at another mill hired a Kabbalist priest to cast the evil eye on Montefiore's efforts. The windmill broke down, replacement parts never arrived, and it never ran again. It appeared that Montefiore's projects were destined to fail. However, a few years after his pioneering effort languished, a plague struck inside the gates, and residents were forced to look at resettling outside the old city. However, shortly after Montefiore's projects began in 1854, a Jewish culture that was exclusive, unbending, and resistant to change established the Orthodox community of Mea Sha'arim. Mea Sha'arim means 100 gates, and it is said that when the area was built in 1875, it was fortified with walls and 100 gates to keep the world and its temptations at bay. Today's gates warn tourists and other worldly influences not to enter. The row houses of Mea Sha'arim form a fortress-like setting. Enter these gates and one is inside an ultra-Orthodox Eastern European ghetto of the 18th century. The predominant language is Yiddish, not Hebrew. The nation of Israel, for the most part, is not recognized by the inhabitants of Mea Sha'arim because the Jewish Messiah has not yet come. They call themselves Haradim, which means God-fearing. The dress code for men and women is identical to that of their ancestors of the Polish ghetto in 1870. Their simple attire includes fur hats, black coats, beards, and long locks of hair for men. Women sport shaved heads, wigs, and scarves, with conservative long dresses and high knee socks. Established in 1870 by Rabbi Vilna Gaon of Lithuania, the community is funded and assisted by like-minded ultra-Orthodox communities from all over the world. Their schools, called yeshivas, still actively debate the Torah. Their synagogues are often festive places and are the center of religious life. Special rabbis perform traditional circumcisions. Young schoolboys kiss the Torah for the first time and are rewarded. Prayer scrolls known as tefillim or phylacteries are bound to the arms and foreheads. From sundown Friday until sundown Saturday, Shabbat is strictly observed. Police barriers prohibit vehicle traffic into Mea Sha'arim. Stores are closed. Writing, handling of money, and the operation of any kind of machinery is strictly forbidden. Today, automobiles traveling from the new city enter Old Jerusalem through an enlarged breach in the wall near the Jaffa Gate. The hole was cut in about 1898 by Turkish rulers. During this period, Jerusalem was still part of Turkey's Ottoman Empire. Events that were later to plunge the world into the First World War were beginning to play themselves out in the Middle East. An uneasy alliance had developed between the Germans and the Turks. German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II and his wife were set to meet with their Turkish allies in Jerusalem. However, a strange problem of international etiquette developed. The Kaiser insisted that he should make a grand entrance into the city to impress the Turkish leaders. He planned to enter through the old Jaffa Gate on horseback, accompanied by a large entourage in open carriages. This grand idea presented a problem for the Turkish authorities. Not only did the angled opening of the old gate make a mounted entry difficult, if not impossible, but according to Muslim tradition, only a conqueror could ride his horse through the gates of Jerusalem. A solution was finally found. The Turks ripped a large hole in the wall near the Jaffa Gate and built a road large enough to accommodate the Kaiser riding in his horse-drawn carriage. The Kaiser rode into the city not as a conqueror, but as a visiting dignitary. The hole is still used for automobile traffic. Jerusalem continued to languish under Turkish rule. The city became tired, dirty, and its infrastructure was almost non-existent. Christians and Jews suffered under heavy prejudice. They weren't allowed to do some of the most basic things: ride horses, ring bells, repair their churches or synagogues. Once an intellectual capital, the city's cultural life began to disappear. By 1890, not a single operating printing press could be found in the old city. Ironically, during this time, the ideas that formed the modern nation of Israel were first introduced in Europe by a man who became the father of Zionism. Born in Budapest in 1860, Theodor Herzl was appalled by the anti-Semitism he witnessed as a correspondent covering Dreyfus Affair in Paris in the late 1890s. He decided that the only solution to the problem would be the creation of a Jewish national state. An audacious bluffer, he went from nation to nation negotiating for a new homeland, but was turned down every time. He wrote and published The Jewish State in 1896, a how-to guide for national independence. Herzl also founded the World Zionist Congress in 1897 and served as its president until his death in 1904 at the age of 44. 13 years later, during World War I, Herzl's dream of a Jewish homeland would become reality as the British won control of Palestine from the Turks and lent a sympathetic ear to the calls of the Zionists. One of the most triumphant scenes of World War I came in 1917, when British General Sir Edmund Allenby entered the Jaffa Gate to accept the Turkish surrender of Palestine. In contrast to the German Kaiser, Allenby voluntarily dismounted and walked his horse through the gate. Ironically, Allenby was in fact eligible to ride through as a conqueror, but he chose the gesture of humility instead. Allenby accepted the Turkish surrender at one of the most dramatic sites in the old city, the huge defensive guard tower and fortress known as the Citadel and David's Tower. The name David's Tower can be confusing, since the structure was built well after David's reign. It is believed early Byzantines mistook the site for the tomb of David, thus creating the name. The structure was actually built by Herod the Great as part of a three-tower system to protect his luxurious palace. It is located on some of the highest ground in the city, making it one of the most strategic defensive locations in the city. When Titus and the Roman legions conquered Jerusalem in the middle of the 1st century, the citadel was one of the final buildings to fall. In fact, it took the Romans almost a month after they had captured the city before they were able to occupy the citadel. Following the 1917 Turkish surrender, a new group of rulers took over Jerusalem, the British. Prior to the surrender, several Allied nations had signed a secret agreement to make Palestine an Arab state, with control of the region split between Britain and France. As part of the agreement, the British ended up with Jerusalem. The next 32 years posed numerous problems between both the British and the Jewish people. During the short British reign, the Old City began a program of restoration. The railway line to the Jaffa harbor was repaired. Holy sites were refurbished, and new museums, hotels, and hospitals were opened. Buildings sprang up all over the city. The British showed an interest in keeping and maintaining the ancient character of the Old City. British Governor Sir Ronald Storrs even decreed that any new structures built must use the local pink and beige stone that was so prevalent in the older sites around Jerusalem. Religious pilgrims, especially Jewish ones, could now freely come and go. And they began coming in record numbers. However, many who came were more than just visitors. Following World War II, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust wanted to return to their homes in Eastern Europe. They were shocked to discover that they were still unwelcome. From August 1945 to May 1946, 64 ships left Europe, bringing 73,000 refugees to Palestine, who intended to settle in the homeland of their ancestors. They were aided by the underground Jewish army, the Haganah. But the British clung to their 1939 immigration limits because of Arab pressure. British forces turned back overcrowded ships or put illegal refugees into overcrowded internment camps. As an act of rebellion against the British, the Haganah proceeded to blow up 9 key bridges in Palestine in one night. On July 22, 1946, an entire wing of Jerusalem's beautiful King David Hotel exploded and collapsed. The bombing killed 91 people. The Irgun, a terrorist organization led by the late Menachem Begin, claimed responsibility. The ongoing tensions and loss of life was too much, and the British people began calling for withdrawal. In February 1947, Great Britain's cabinet decided to let the United Nations resolve the Palestine problem. After 9 months of debating, the UN produced a plan to partition Palestine between a Jewish and an Arab state. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted in favor of the plan. Even as Jews danced in the streets, Arab rioting erupted throughout Palestine. In the first 5 months of 1948, every isolated Jewish village was attacked. In less than 6 months, 6,000 Jewish soldiers and civilians were killed. On May 15, 1948, the British pulled out of Palestine, and the Jewish State of Israel was born. Nowhere are the scars of the 1948 War of Independence more apparent than at the incredible Zion Gate. The gate was one of the focal points in the heavy fighting that broke out following the British retreat. As soon as the British troops were out of sight, the various Arab and Jewish factions of the city began vying for control of strategic sites within the gates. Some of the lopsided battles did go a long way toward helping build the Jewish army's later reputation for toughness. In one brief battle in mid-May, a ragtag Jewish force under Colonel David Shatil briefly took control of the Zion Gate. But to get the gate, they had to nearly destroy it. The War of Independence lasted for 7 months. Israel was victorious, except in Jerusalem. The Jewish quarter of the Old City could not hold out against overwhelming opposition, and ultimately fell to Jordanian legionnaires. At first, the city sustained only minor damage. But after Jewish nationalists surrendered to the victorious Jordanians, real destruction began to occur. Arab militants looted synagogues, schools, and homes, then began dynamiting structures in the Jewish quarter. In the end, 27 synagogues were destroyed, including the historic Nachmanides synagogue that dated from 1267. For nearly 19 years, the area around the Zion Gate became a no-man's land between Israelis and the Jordanians. To wander into the area was to invite sniper fire from the Jordanian troops manning the ramparts of the old city wall. Concrete barriers were erected to protect pedestrians. Not until after the Six-Day War in 1967 could the Jewish people rebuild and restore the Jewish quarter. It is now one of the most modern and attractive parts of the old city. Even today, one of the first things a visitor to the Zion Gate notices is the bullet holes that dot the wall around the old entryway. The fighting during the 1948 War of Independence wasn't the first conflict this old gate had seen. It was even designed to provide a defense for the city during the frequent wars and battles it had to live through over the centuries. The Zion Gate, like the Jaffa Gate, makes a turn as it passes through the city wall. The idea was to make it difficult for a mounted soldier, especially one carrying a lance, to maneuver through the gate. The result today is that the gate frequently provides a dangerous passage for modern automobiles. Many a vehicle has lost a headlight or sustained a crumpled fender, making the sharp turn. After gaining control of the old city, Jordan closed off the Jewish quarter and denied access to the Jewish holy sites, including the Western Wall. Unable to pray at the Holy Wall, Israelis found that the only place where they could catch a glimpse of the sacred wall was Mount Zion, just outside the Zion Gate. Mount Zion was a quiet land between the warring forces, and it provided a place to congregate for prayer. The Jewish people frequently gathered together to pray that the Holy Wall would again be open to the nation. But even after a 1949 ceasefire, the Western Wall remained off-limits. So the spiritual significance of Mount Zion continued to grow. The small mountain, which gave the Zion Gate its name, became a holy site for all three of the major religious groups of Jerusalem. The Jewish, the Christians, and the Muslims all built shrines near the top. In earlier times, when the city's walls protected a much larger area, the mount was actually inside the city gates. But when Suleiman the Magnificent rebuilt the walls in the 16th century, the mount was left outside. One of the holy sites on Mount Zion is the Tomb of David, often identified as the last resting place of the Jewish king. Many historians say the tomb isn't old enough to hold David's remains, but it continues to be a popular site for pilgrims. Mount Zion is also the location of the cenacle, which is said to be one possible site of Christ's Last Supper or Passover Seder. Many historians doubt the authenticity of this location, but nearly all agree that the Last Supper probably took place somewhere on Mount Zion. Today, there are a number of religious institutions on Mount Zion. There is a rabbinical seminary where young Jewish men study for a life steeped in the Mishnah and the Gemara, which makes up the Talmud, the codified oral law of Judaism. There are Christian institutions, including a seminary where young Greeks study for the priesthood. Mount Zion affords a wonderful view to the west into the modern city of Jerusalem, and to the east, the Mount of Olives. Today, the beautiful Mount of Olives and the surrounding Kidron Valley are dotted with Muslim and Jewish cemeteries. On the Mount of Olives, the Jews buried their dead by the tens of thousands. Today, the vast burial ground here is the largest cemetery in the world. To be buried here is to be, in the Jewish tradition, the first to awaken upon the coming of the new Messiah. The price for a burial on this highly strategic ground is over $50,000 per plot. The dead in Jerusalem have always, according to Jewish law, been buried outside the confines of the city. Thus, we can always know the city limits by the location of Jewish cemeteries at any given time in history. Because of the desire not to build or live on or near a cemetery, the old city has remained hemmed in by graves on all sides and has expanded very little except in the last century. Jerusalem abounds with underground tombs as well as above-ground cemeteries. The cool, haunting interiors of these crypts can be explored by the more adventurous pilgrim. The very rich could afford magnificent burial sites, like the tomb of Absalom, the tomb of Zechariah, and the tomb of the Pharaoh's daughter in the Kidron Valley. Many date to the 7th century BC. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the Mount Zion region was also home to a devout group of Jewish clerics, the Essenes. In fact, many believe a gate named after the Essenes once existed in the general area where the Zion Gate is now located. The Essenes supported themselves by preparing Torah scrolls, writing the 5 books of Moses on thin sheepskin parchments. The Essenes are believed to have authored the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found purely by accident in 1947. The scrolls were stored in ancient pottery jars in a desert cave near the monastery of the Essenes at Qumran. The well-preserved old scrolls, which date back to about 200 years before Christ, are believed to be the earliest manuscripts of the Old Testament, sacred to both Jews and Christians. The scrolls now rest in a dramatic museum known as the Shrine of the Book, which was designed to resemble the tops of the jars in which the scrolls were found. Many Jewish and Christians point to the similarity between some of the ancient preserved writings and the current Old Testament. They see this as evidence for the historical accuracy of the biblical texts through the centuries. The Essenes were people of extreme faith. They toiled for countless hours to make sure holy texts would be available to future generations, even though they believed the world would soon end. One fascinating parallel in the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian faiths is that the 3 groups trace their spiritual lineage back to the patriarch Abraham. Islam's most sacred book, the Quran, calls Abraham one who turned away from idolatry and came to his Lord with an undivided heart. The Quran calls Islam the religion of Abraham. Jewish and Christians alike claim Abraham as the ultimate ancestor of both their faiths. Many even trace the heavily Muslim Arab people to Abraham's son, Ishmael, and trace the Jewish people to Isaac, Ishmael's stepbrother. Yet this common lineage hasn't enabled the 3 groups to live together peacefully. The centuries of fighting between the Jewish people and the Muslims, and the bloody Christian crusades, indicate the history of misunderstandings that have historically overshadowed the shared background. However, despite their differences, Muslims, Jews, and Christians made one significant contribution to world history. Together, they held to the idea of one God. The peaceful reverence of Jerusalem's holy sites never seems to last long. Always war or terrorism or religious conflict comes along to disturb the worship. For instance, following the 1948 War of Independence, the next major battle came in 1967, a sudden and violent upheaval called the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War began on June 5th, when the Israelis became concerned about an Egyptian naval blockade in the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. Under the Jewish commander Moshe Dayan, Israeli forces liberated Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, as well as the West Bank and the Golan Heights. In Jerusalem, the Jewish army struck Jordanian positions in the Old City, attacking through the Lion's Gate. There was fierce house-to-house fighting in the tiny alleyways and twisting streets of the Old City. But within hours, Jerusalem was under Jewish control. For the first time in thousands of years, the Jewish nation possessed the Western Wall and the other holy sites. The years to follow have been eventful and often bloody in the Old City, but the Jewish faithful still pray freely at the Western Wall. Muslims still control the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. And Christian pilgrims still openly trace Christ's footsteps around the 14 stations of the cross. But the mystery is, what does the future hold for Old Jerusalem? Perhaps the future can be seen through the Old City's only sealed gate, the spectacular Golden Gate, the Gate of Destiny. Believers from all the faiths in Jerusalem instinctively realize that the future holds big things for the ancient Golden Gate. The Golden Gate is actually a huge double entrance, the only gate to cut directly through the city wall into the sacred Temple Mount area. Arabs refer to the southernmost of the two openings as the Gate of Mercy, and the northernmost as the Gate of Repentance. This reflects their belief that the gate will someday be part of the last judgment of man at the end of history. The original gate was apparently constructed in the 7th century by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. Legend has it that the gate was built to allow Emperor Heraclius to return a sacred relic, believed to be from Christ's cross, to the Holy Sepulchre in the city. It is said that the emperor built the gate to allow his army to make a triumphant entrance into the city, proudly bearing the sacred prize. Later, when the city came under Muslim control, the gate was completely walled in. The Muslims sealed the gate in an attempt to thwart Jewish prophecy that a returning Messiah or Savior would enter the city through the Golden Gate. For good measure, they placed a cemetery just outside the gate, in the belief that the Jewish Messiah would be a high priest and therefore forbidden by Jewish law to enter a cemetery, as he would become defiled and unable to perform his priestly duties. Some Orthodox Jewish leaders dispute this, claiming the Messiah will be a descendant of King David and not a high priest. The Messiah could therefore travel through a cemetery without violating any laws. Many Christians join in this prophecy about the importance of the gate, agreeing that it will be an entrance for a Messiah. However, they believe that the true Messiah came nearly 2,000 years ago in the form of an itinerant Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth. They now expect their Christ, or Messiah, Jesus, to return to Jerusalem as a final act, re-entering the city through the Golden Gate. All three religious groups expect dramatic and spectacular occurrences during these end-time events. Jewish people and Muslims alike expect these final happenings to concentrate on the nearby Mount of Olives and in the Kidron Valley that spreads out in front of the Golden Gate. Christians find in the New Testament book of Luke that Jesus Christ fulfills most of the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. The Old Testament speaks of two appearances of the Messiah, the first as a lamb and the second as a lion. When he returns as the lion, in that day he will wrap up history as we know it. In the New Testament Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is quoted as saying that the Messiah's return will be as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Matthew's portrayal of the last days is strangely similar to the predictions of the end time in the Old Testament book of Zechariah. That prophecy calls for the Jewish Messiah to stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will move toward the north and the other half toward the south. One of the most marvelous events in the end-time prophecies of the Old Testament calls for the pious dead of the earth to rise from their graves when the Jewish Messiah returns. Orthodox Jewish believers expect their Messiah to blow a ram's horn to call forth the dead. The Jewish faithful who are waiting for their Messiah believe that when he comes, he will lead the reconstruction of a Jewish empire and will initiate the building of the third temple on the old Temple Mount. There is argument about the promised Jewish empire, with some Israelis believing the current nation of Israel fulfills that promise. Others think there is an even more glorious state to come. All these end-time events would provide a spectacular closing scene for Earth's human drama. But all the ancient prophecies could put the diverse religious believers of Jerusalem on a spiritual collision course. Many of the most strongly held beliefs and prejudices of the old city's faithful would obviously come into direct conflict during the events leading up to the Day of Judgment. The biggest clash of these final days could actually begin at the most sacred of Jerusalem's holy sites, the Temple Mount. In 1967, when Israel captured the Old City and the Temple Mount, it tried to preserve peace by allowing Muslims to administer the sacred site. Muslim leaders reacted strongly, forbidding any Jew or Christian from praying openly on the holy ground. They also refused to permit the building of any synagogues or churches anywhere inside the temple complex. Any hint of rebuilding the old Jewish temple is considered an outrage by Muslims, and many of the more zealous have sworn to defend the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque to the last drop of their blood. Yet Jewish tradition holds that God has irrevocably commanded that a new temple be built. The Jerusalem Talmud says Jews may even build a temporary temple before the Messianic era begins. In fact, a group of Jerusalem residents are working out plans for the third temple even today. Each day, Jewish faithful at the Western Wall pray the popular prayer, "May it be thy will that the temple be speedily rebuilt in our days." And each day, Muslim faithful become more and more dedicated to keeping their holy sites on the Temple Mount intact. Of the 8 gates surrounding Old Jerusalem, the Golden Gate is being watched continuously by Christians, Muslims, and the Jewish faithful. For the Jewish faithful, the Golden Gate symbolizes the entry for the Messiah and the beginning of a Messianic age. For the Christians, this gate promises the second coming of Jesus, their Savior. For Muslims, the Golden Gate will someday be part of the Last Judgment at the end of history. And so, like strands of rope which intertwine without ever really joining, this is a city interwoven with the dreams, hopes, and the desires of the 3 great Western religions. Here, the very act of living is a sacrament. The feat of surviving against all odds for thousands of years is the miracle. And the stones and gates provide mute testimony to the difficulty of just keeping one's faith alive in this holiest of lands. When these gates are open, they represent reception, tolerance, and inclusion. They are the meeting point of men of different races, religions, and beliefs. When the gates are or have been closed, they represent exclusion, intolerance, and fear. Men of different races, religions, and beliefs are censored, exiled, or slaughtered. The lesson to be learned is a difficult one. Like the human mind, the 8 gates of Jerusalem are strongest, as they are today, when they are open. If there is hope to be found in these gates, it is that they will always remain open to those who come seeking peace. These are the doorways to the one city on earth which celebrates our relationship with God. All have come from the same Creator, and all will return the same way. They have built this house together. The challenge is to enter it with grace, respect, and tolerance, and then to leave it undamaged for those who follow. Then, and only then, will the gates of time be the gates to the city of peace.
Thank you for joining me for our journey through the gates of time, the story of the 8 gates of Jerusalem. From the Zion Gate, I'm Richard Kiley.